I think we start and gradually people will come inside, abandoning the food that is always tempting. And so welcome all to the historian talk on Bretton Woods at 75 of the 2019 ABCDE conference. Welcome Devesh and welcome Ben. It's good to have you here. And we thank DEC for a beautiful conference that this year is dedicated to the 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, where the bank and the fund were born. Who am I? My name is Elisa. I'm the chief archivist for the bank group, so I take care of the institutional memory. And as you know, the archives of the bank are the oldest and the largest and the only multi-regional development archives. And we are also one of the largest archives on multilateralism. The archives of the bank, I have 5 minutes to talk to you about the archives of the bank, so listen to me. The archives of the bank, we keep them in Pennsylvania, 6 hours drive from here, in a former limestone mine underground. It's a city underground where 2,000 people work every day. And the bank has there 3 vaults, actually 4, and 1 team of 4 staff, and then a team of contractors. Every night, a shuttle goes from headquarters, actually from the mine to headquarters and back. So if you recall records the day before by 1, we serve them to your office the following morning. This is quite impressive, right? But we are in the digital age, so we need to move on and possibly digitize as much as we can these paper archives. Of course, preserving the paper that is still the record copy, but making the collections and the holding accessible easily, because no one, even the young historians, the researchers, want and have the time to spend on going through massive amounts of paper and boxes that we declassify for them. So, not all the times you see the archivists. Actually, the archivists live underground and emerge only from there on special occasions like today. And we are underground in MCC3, if you want to visit our reading room. We are underground at the mine. And we like to say that we work underground in an invisible way to take care of the roots of the development tree. The bank, the development community are the trees. Very often we only focus on the fruit, but there is no tree that can bear good fruits if the roots are disattended, if the roots are not healthy. So the work that we do in managing the information and the institutional memory is to feed the nutrients of the past, the lessons learned, the successes, and of course also the failures into the roots of the tree for the bank and the development community to thrive and to be successful. This is our job, and I would like to share with you 2 quotes. One is 30 years old, and it comes from Bill Diamond. Bill Diamond entered the bank in 1947. He had a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins, 1942, and he went high up in the career in the bank, and he was responsible for many, many things, including South Asia regions, etc. And when the bank, he retired after 30 years, when the bank decided to write his first history of the first 50 years, in 1990, the bank formed a committee, and Bill Diamond, who was at the time 80-something, was a member of this committee. Another member was, of course, Devesh Kapoor, who is seated here at this table, and he's the one that then took the lead with other historians and delivered this project that is the Brookings history of the first 50 years of the bank. So in 1990, the 80-years-old Bill Diamond, historian by training and senior manager in the bank, said, "It's hard to see how the history of the second half of the 20th century can be written without allusions, without considerable references to the World Bank." So he was advocating for a history of the first 50 years to be written. And he was saying, in addition, that writing the history of the World Bank was a matter of institutional accountability, and also because the bank was one of the premier development think tanks. So there was this sense of responsibility for the evolution of the organization to be documented and made available. A sense that what was the institutional memory of this bank was a public good. And the second quote that I want to share with you, to come then to a question, is a quote from 6 years ago. 6 years ago, we held a workshop, a 2-day workshop on using history to inform development policy, and the archives organized it with DEC, with the legal department. We discussed for 2 days very, very intensively and passionately, and we were at the time in the basement of the J building. So it took the 75th of Bretton Woods to bring history out of the basements and deliver it to the Preston. This is a success. So 6 years ago, in this workshop, Arun Devesh Kapoor said something that to me is fundamental. That is, everything is innovative if there is no history. This was his keynote, right? So, and it's very true. And this is one more good reason, in addition to the Bill Diamond, to feel that the history of the bank is a public good, because we have to base innovation, and also innovation in development, on knowledge of the past, on a command of the past, what was tried, what worked, what didn't. And so very often we see innovation as something that is advertised as the novelty, but the novelty cannot be based on ignorance of the past, and especially in a field like development, when the success of an initiative affects millions of people. We cannot play and not know our past. Of course, this is the voice of the archivist. I cannot come here and talk to you about the future, but I can, because we want to build a future that is based on solid knowledge of our experience. That is a public good. There is no other organization like the one that we have, and the archivists feel that the archives that collect the evidence of 75 years of work are equally a public good. And so we have started, thanks to an access to information policy, we have started to declassify our archives, and possibly as much as we can digitize and make available online to everybody. We have now 330,000 documents and reports since 1946 available online, with like 250,000 unique users a month coming and visit this collection. A subset of these is the beautiful Open Knowledge Repository that contains just the last 10 years and about 28,000 documents, super curated by the team. And we have millions of downloads. So this is to tell you that there is an interest in what the bank is doing and did. We have digitized the whole collection of President McNamara, including the handwritten correspondence and everything, and it's now available online. And on this collection, we have selected McNamara because is one of the pivotal points in the history of the bank, and it was a collection constantly requested by researchers. So you find it now available. And on these McNamara collections, we are now partnering with Columbia University, the History Lab, to see how artificial intelligence can be used on the historical materials, and we are really working actively with them. We hope to be able to show you something in the fall, really to display why we should digitize, because then we would have a completely different approach to the access to these collections. We have digitized over 1,000 presidential records to celebrate the 75th of Bretton Woods. They are now online from 1946 up to last year. These president speeches give you a sense of the direction of the organization, the focus over the decades. We have an interactive timeline in the archives website. It's beautiful, it's growing, you can play with it, and when there are records digitized, we connect the entries in the timeline to the records themselves, and you can drill down and go to the sources and to the evidence. Then we have oral histories. Hundreds of oral histories since 1961, most of them declassified and available in the website. So I encourage you to go and play with these things that are just fascinating. And for the celebration of the 75th of Bretton Woods, and in sync with the ABCDE conference and working with DEC, we have prepared in the atrium, and you can just go walk and see it, a beautiful exhibit. I'm a good seller of what we do, I assume I am. A beautiful exhibit on the history of the bank and the 7 decades and the evolution. You find it in the atrium. You find it associated also with vitrines of archival documents that for the first time have left the mine in Pennsylvania to be displayed to you. This exhibit is here only this week. We hope to repeat it at annual meetings in the fall, but we don't know yet. So please go and stick your nose in the history of the World Bank. Tomorrow and Wednesday at the executive dining rooms, we have 2 heritage days where we serve you the farewell dinner menu of the Bretton Woods Conference. And we even have a band playing tunes from the 1940s, and again, we display records and history for you guys. Go make your reservation, have a nice lunch tomorrow and Wednesday. And then don't forget to take selfies with Lord Keynes over there, and with Harry Dexter White, who was the US Secretary of the Treasury at the time, and was Undersecretary. No, sorry. I mean Morgenthau. Yes, Morgenthau. So he was the secretary. So the question is why there is not Harry Dexter White there? The archivist decided to erase him from history simply because we couldn't find a good picture of Harry Dexter White standing tall so that we could turn it into a cutout for you to take selfies with. So take the selfies. Okay, and please post them. Now, of course, I give the floor to Devesh and Ben, and with a question. Is it time to write the history of the last 25 years of World Bank? Is this a moral imperative to share with the development community what we do? Successes and failures. And now I'm introducing you super quickly. Devesh is a Star Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and Director of Asia Programs at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS. The reason why we have him here and we love him dearly is because he led the whole effort on the history of the first 50 years of World Bank. And we owe to him the World Bank, its first half century with John Lewis and Richard Webb, published by Brookings. Prior to joining SAIS, Devesh was Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for Advanced Study of India at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Devesh. And then we have Ben. Ben is a senior fellow and director of international economics, as well as the official historian in residence at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He is the founding editor of International Finance. Prior to joining the Council, he was director of the International Economics Program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London. But the reason we have you here on top of all this and why we love you dearly, Ben, is The Battle of Bretton Woods, the book that you will find outside when you leave, don't rush away. The Battle of Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, Harry Dexter White, that we killed, erased from history, and the making of New World Order. So the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Now? Yeah, okay. So before I start, I just want to make a pitch about the archives, which is one of the crown jewels, I think, of the bank. I had spent countless hours there before everything was digitized. And it's not just that it has such a fabulous collection, like for researchers, but the staff there is one of the best people at the bank that I've had the pleasure of working with. The only thing I have some reservations is about the food, which was served in 1946. It was pretty bland, I'm pretty sure. So I'm not sure if that's very attractive. But nonetheless, the archives is a real fabulous place. So I think what I want to do is to just start with a very simple question to Ben. What sort of led you to write the book? You didn't have anything better to do?
This was back in 2009, early on, as in the financial crisis, as it was beginning to spill out globally, and you had world leaders from British Prime Minister Gordon Brown to French President Nicolas Sarkozy, all calling for, quote unquote, a new Bretton Woods. So I thought it might be a good idea to take a look at the old original one. I was very surprised to see that despite the fact that there had been an enormous amount written about Bretton Woods as a system, there was virtually nothing written about it as an historical episode, and it turned out to be far more fascinating history than I could have imagined at the outset.
So the book has a strain of sort of on the conflictual origins of like Bretton Woods. The title itself is, there's the word, the Battle of Bretton Woods. And it's about a dominant power, which is the US. It soon becomes a sort of hegemonic power. But at that time, in 43, 44, grappling with a sort of declining power, which is the UK. And the story is sort of personified through two people, Harry Dexter White on behalf of the US, and sort of John Maynard Keynes on behalf of the UK. And sort of leaves one to ask the question, how much do personalities matter in this? So for instance, historians, business schools, they talk of sort of leadership, but the social sciences are very, very dismissive of this as a variable. You cannot generalize, you cannot do causal inference, you cannot do RCTs, all the things which we love. So were the outcomes of Bretton Woods largely predetermined by the stark structural differences in power? In other words, if these two people had been different people, would the outcomes have been any different?
I would certainly say that if Harry Dexter White hadn't been in Washington at the time, and he didn't want to be in Washington initially, he wanted to be in Moscow studying Soviet planning, there would likely have never have been a conference. Okay, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't have been some sort of organic handover of economic and geopolitical power in the world from Great Britain to the United States, but there's no doubt that the Bretton Woods Agreement hastened it, and this was quite planned. Now, if there had been no Harry Dexter White, what would we have had? President Roosevelt had absolutely no interest in international economic coordination, particularly monetary coordination. In fact, he unilaterally destroyed the 1933 London Economic Conference by condemning international monetary coordination as, quote unquote, a fetish of international bankers. His Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, who was Treasury Secretary for 12 years remarkably, knew absolutely nothing about economics and could not have come up with these ideas on his own. So who came up with the ideas? Harry Dexter White was a bureaucratic temp for most of his time at the Treasury, and Morgenthau deliberately kept him that way because he didn't want White taking credit for any things that he was creating. He was even proud of the fact that in 1942 he said, President Roosevelt doesn't even know who Harry Dexter White is. But he's absolutely dependent on White for ideas, and White is an absolute font of ideas. So one of the things I discovered in his archives in Princeton was a long memo. He was constantly writing memos to himself, essays on the future of gold. It was really quite remarkable that he had this much time on his hands, given how hard he was working. But in this memo written in 1936, he's already planning an international monetary conference. in which his primary aim is going to be to best the British Empire. And he's already counting how many sterling countries there are in the world and how he'd like to whittle down that number by the start of the conference so that the US would be in a relatively stronger position at the conference than Great Britain. Now, Keynes, for his part, had for many years been writing treatises about what a new international monetary system might look like. He already, well before Bretton Woods, had the idea for a new supranational currency that would lead into his so-called Bancor proposal for Bretton Woods. But he was also personally very influential. My belief is that if there had been no Keynes, the British would have walked away from Bretton Woods. Contrary to most popular perceptions of history, Keynes's position as head of the British delegation was not taken for granted as being in Britain's interest within the British civil servant. In fact, one top British civil servant, Otto Clarke, was absolutely scathing about Keynes and basically suggested that Keynes was doing this for his own glory. This was not in America's interest. The Americans were trying to impose these outrageous geopolitical conditions upon them, elimination of imperial preference, making the pound sterling convertible again at an overvalued exchange rate before its time. There was no reason for us, the British, to accept this when we could borrow money from other governments, like the Canadian government, from other institutions, even within the United States, like the Export-Import Bank, that didn't have this geopolitical agenda that the US Treasury had. So I would also argue that if Keynes hadn't been there, I don't think the British would have agreed to the conference or the conditions that the United States set.
In your book, Keynes doesn't come off too well in your account. Surprisingly, his sheer intellectual strength becomes a weakness as a sort of negotiator, a sort of intellectual hubris, as it were. There's a nice quote you have from someone saying, "That man is a menace to international relations." Now, that's not about Trump. That is about Keynes, and it is said by James Mead, who was a fellow Britisher who got the Nobel Prize
and a great admirer
of Keynes. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Harry Dexter White used to get literally physically sick before he would go into negotiations with Keynes because he didn't like to be humiliated by him in front of his colleagues. But that didn't mean he had to concede anything to him. The Americans were the one who controlled the money bags, as the British put it. The British were completely dependent on American financial aid, not just to get through the war, but through the immediate post-war period. So when you're negotiating basically your national survival with a foreign government, you're not in a particularly strong position. And you should probably not be trying to humiliate your opponent intellectually. And Keynes just literally could not control himself in negotiations. If you were effectively his straight man and said something stupid, he would pounce on it. He couldn't resist himself. So for example, just one little example, in 1945, he's negotiating with the US Treasury a post-war loan from the United States, which he had previously said that Britain should never accept. In fact, should be quite the opposite. The Americans should be writing Britain an enormous check for all that Britain had done in the common cause before the United States had entered the war. And at one point, a skeptical Treasury official says, well, you know, look, things could change in the post-war period. You might find gold in a cave. And Keynes shot back, gold in a cave. Frank, I like that. Write that down. We agree to that. So if we find gold in a cave, sure, we can abandon all these positions, but that's not going to be the way it is. And so the Americans, not just Harry Dexter White, but Henry Morgenthau, really did consider him to be a menace. And the British government was not even convinced that he was helpful to their cause.
There's a very interesting line you have where you say, here at Bretton Woods was the American Treasury Secretary tethering the historic event to the mast of his country's superpower ambitions. And the key, as you write, was to make the dollar the indispensable currency and move the center of gravity of international finance from London to New York and to Washington. Yeah, sorry. And how important are reserve currencies to great power ambitions? Is it indispensable?
Well, in this case, it was particularly important. I was just at the session earlier on multilateralism, in which there was a paper on the role of gold at Bretton Woods. We forget today, but in people's consciousness in the 1940s, gold was money, and national currencies were vouchers that were exchangeable for gold. Of course, nobody intended to have to exchange them, but it was important to people that it was ultimately convertible to gold. But by the time we get to 1944, there is only one currency left on the global stage that is legitimately, credibly convertible into gold, and that is the US dollar. So the vast majority of the delegations who came to Bretton Woods were not there to make intellectual contributions. They were there to find out what the United States intended to do about a problem that many of them believed that the United States had done much to create. That is the fact that the United States controlled about 2/3 of the monetary gold stock, that a revival of international and trade and commerce would therefore be impossible without the United States doing something grand to aid a redistribution of monetary gold, or surrogates for it.
We'll come back to it because to sort of revisit whether a convertible renminbi would be equivalently critical to China's great power ambitions, but I'll come back to that later. There's an interesting point you make. You argue that Britain was pressurized into making a Faustian bargain, in your words. Give up the one thing that seemed to guarantee its continued existence as an empire in exchange for enough money and goods to make it through the war. And so you write, I quote, at every step to Bretton Woods, the Americans had reminded the British in as brutal a manner as necessary that there was no room in the new order for the remnants of British imperial glory. Did Bretton Woods effectively seal the end of the British Empire and provide the spark that lit the fire of decolonization?
It was a component of it, a significant component of it. I should emphasize that the United States was not being in its own collective mind, purely selfish. The FDR administration did consider the United States to be the great anti-colonial power in the world, and it did have many allies in the developing world at the time. For example, as you know, the United States was allied with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime in China during the war. It was an uncomfortable alliance, but the nationalists in China did see an American victory in the war as a major step for decolonization. At Bretton Woods, you and I were discussing this at lunch, the Indian delegation humiliated the British delegation by insisting to the Americans that this conference needed to do something about Britain's debt to its colonies, in particular, of course, to England. So there were basically three conditions that the Americans imposed on Britain for aid during the war and the immediate post-war period. One is the elimination of imperial preference. That was the mechanism by which Britain granted to itself privileged access to the markets of its colonies and dominions. This was anathema not just to American businesses, but again to the Roosevelt administration from a geopolitical perspective. Second, that Britain needed to make the pound sterling once again fully convertible at an overvalued exchange rate by a certain date. That date was July 15th, 1947 for the British, a day that will live in infamy, that marked its bankruptcy. And you can see the British Empire collapsing in early 1947, one pillar after another of British imperial glory, Burma, Palestine, Greece, India, all collapsing as the British prepare for convertibility. That is, everyone will be lined up at their doors waiting to cash in their worthless sterling for US dollars, and that was a condition set at Bretton Woods. And finally, Britain would have to accept this international monetary conference in which the US dollar would be given a privileged place. And that was, in fact, the issue of greatest disagreement, sometimes intemperate disagreement, between the United States and Great Britain in the 2-year run-up to Bretton Woods, and in particular between two people, Harry Dexter White and John Maynard Keynes.
Now, for the Americans, and especially for Morgenthau and White, if the UK was one key protagonist, the other was the US banking and financial sector, right? Bretton Woods was seen by them as a new deal for a new world. And in Morgenthau's famous words, it would drive the usurious moneylender from the temple of international finance. Did they succeed?
In some ways, yes. Morgenthau said that his aim at Bretton Woods had been to, quote unquote, move the financial center of the world from London and Wall Street to the US Treasury. That is, he was trying to constrain the roles of international bankers in the international financial system. And even to constrain the role of central banks, which was still, might sound remarkable today, but in the 30s and early 40s, seen by the US Treasury as being essentially an arm of private finance. And of course, that's the way the Federal Reserve had actually evolved. And so there is no question that Bretton Woods did help national treasuries arrogate certain powers that had previously been in many developed countries more concentrated within the private financial sector.
Now,
Okay, make one further point about that. Capital flows. This is probably an important point to make. This is one area where Keynes and White completely agreed. There had been absolutely no intention of ever liberalizing capital accounts through the new International Monetary Fund. In fact, if anything, White was more adamant about keeping private capital flows restricted than Keynes was.
And of course, we know that the fund moved away from that, especially in the 90s and 2000s, with large consequences. Now, Keynes had an option, right? And the American bankers, they did not, of course, want this to happen, so they offered a large loan.
Correct.
When you now look back since Bretton Woods, what do you think impinges on national sovereignty more, private finance or international financial institutions controlled by powerful countries?
Which impinges on
sort of national sovereignty.
Sovereignty. I would certainly argue that the private financial markets are more powerful. They've obviously grown exponentially since World War II in a way that the IMF and World Bank certainly have not. Having said that, the IMF has emerged since the collapse of Bretton Woods as a vitally important, for better or for worse, crisis firefighter. And that is, again, a role that neither Keynes nor White had ever foreseen for the IMF. In fact, if they could be revived today, they would be shocked to see the IMF playing this role. They would argue that that reveals certain flaws in the international operation of the international monetary system, that they would feel that their systems would have done a better job controlling.
Now, one of the flaws which you point out in your book is that the IMF was handicapped by limited capacity to influence the actions either of countries with robust balance of payments, the creditor countries, or of the US, the issuer of the world's reserve currency, the dollar. This was recognized in the Bretton Woods Conference. It was unresolved then. It still remains unresolved. Is that a fatal flaw for international monetary cooperation? And it gets expressed in things like over time, the Triffin paradox and so on.
Sure. Again, Keynes and White had very different visions for the institution. Now, Keynes being a representative of the world's largest debtor country, naturally had very different incentives. And he viewed the IMF not so much as an institution with its own volition, but as an ATM for debtor countries. He didn't want any questions asked. White had a vastly different view of what the institution should be. His view is really manifested in the way the institution operates today. He viewed it as being manned by an army of technocrats, well-paid technocrats, who would tell countries what to do when they got into problems. Literally tell them what to do. Now, the British and others did manage to tamp this down over several years of negotiations, but that was White's view. Now, as you can imagine, there were concerns expressed in the US Congress about this. In particular, Republican congressmen said, well, we don't want foreign technocrats meddling in our internal monetary and fiscal affairs, and White was very happy to explain why they didn't have to worry. He said, of course, the way we've written the formula for votes, we are the only country with veto power. So if these technocrats should ever write a report saying that we should do X, Y, or Z, you can read the report, give it all due consideration, and then, and I quote, throw it in the basket. So that's how the Americans reconciled, on the one hand, the IMF being a very powerful institution in which technocrats would control not just international finance, but a lot of domestic finance, with sovereignty. That is the only country that would have true sovereignty within the system would be the United States.
Now, since this is a World Bank conference on development economics, we should talk about the bank here a bit. The World Bank was a sideshow at Bretton Woods, right? Development was certainly not on the agenda. It was barely there mentioned. White's initial draft called for a bank for reconstruction of the United and Associated Nations. The invitation to the 44 governments like to Bretton Woods was, quote, for the purposes of formulating definite proposals for an IMF and possibly, right, and I emphasize the word possibly, a bank for reconstruction and development. For White, the prize was clearly the IMF, right? By one estimate, barely less than 10% of the 14 days in Bretton Woods was spent on discussions on the bank. And in your book, the index on the IMF is 24 lines, on the World Bank, barely 2. Now, when you look back at what happened at Bretton Woods and how sort of the bank, which was really an afterthought in many ways, but it emerges and becomes, especially for poor countries, a much more important player, sort of on a much more, if you want to call it, day-to-day basis than the fund. What does it tell us about institutional design and the inadvertent happenings of history?
Besides the Americans and the British, The other delegations at Bretton Woods had very little influence over the structure of the IMF or the monetary system that it was going to preside over. The World Bank was different. By the time we get to Bretton Woods, there were no significant differences between the United States and Great Britain on what the World Bank would look like. It was going to be an institution dedicated to post-war reconstruction. And because it's not controversial, Harry Dexter White assigns John Maynard Keynes to head the commission to create the World Bank, to keep him away from the main event, which is creating the IMF and the new international monetary system, which he kept to himself. And if you read the book, you'll enjoy the machinations he uses to make sure that Keynes never knows what's going on, even after he leaves the hotel. But as you can imagine, the other delegations had a big problem with this, particularly the Latin Americans, who of course, their economies were not nearly as affected by World War II. They had not suffered any military damage, and they said, why should our hard-earned dollars be used to reconstruct rich European states? And so that's how the development focus got welded on to the post-war reconstruction focus, which was to be the initial emphasis. Still, in the early years of the bank, and the fund for that matter, the institutions did relatively little because their role was taken over by the Marshall Plan. So it's really not for quite some time, really over a decade, until both institutions start, as it were, taking on a life of their own and becoming very relevant to the operation of the international financial system.
You have a very interesting anecdote, which I think will be interesting for our audience, that it was not at all clear that the president of the World Bank should be American and the head of the fund should be European. It happened by pure happenstance, and it would be nice to hear from you how that happened.
Yeah, that turned out to be by far the most fascinating part of the story. When I started the research, I was really quite baffled because it was clear from going through the archives that the Americans cared deeply about the fund, but they didn't care at all about the bank. As you said yourself, even if it hadn't been created at Bretton Woods, that they would have gone home quite happily as long as they got what they wanted for the fund. So why on earth would the Americans hand power over to the Europeans? And here's the answer that I reconstructed from a number of different archival sources. In January of '46, President Truman nominates Harry Dexter White to be the first American executive director of the fund. And he is going to nominate him to be the first managing director of the fund. But then he receives an intervention from none other than FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who sends him a long memorandum arguing that the president shouldn't even think of something like this because he, Hoover, could prove that Harry Dexter White was in fact a Soviet agent. Now, President Truman doesn't believe Hoover. He thinks Hoover's a nut. But he knows he has a huge political problem on his hands because if he goes forward with this nomination, Hoover is going to leak it, and President Truman will have a big political scandal on his hands. His Treasury Secretary and his Secretary of State convince him to try to withdraw the nomination for executive director, but it's already gone through a Senate nominating committee, and Truman doesn't want anybody asking questions about this. So he argues to his cabinet, look, I can quarantine this guy as US executive director. We can monitor his activities. Nobody will know about it. I'm going to let this go through. But they weren't going to let him become the managing director because they knew Hoover would pounce in that case. So in March of '46, right before the Savannah Conference to inaugurate the IMF, the Treasury Secretary Fred Vinson meets with Keynes. who's still head of the British delegation, and tells him that after due consideration, the United States has decided that in order to secure the confidence of the American investment community, we want presidency of the World Bank, and it would be ungracious of us to take both institutions. Now, the Americans were anything but gracious at the time. So as you can imagine, Keynes was rather shocked by this. But the only reason it turns out why the IMF is run by a European today is because of President Truman's efforts to cover up this spy scandal. And to make a long story extremely short, Hoover, who was in many, many cases overzealous in his pursuit of communists, didn't know half of it when it came to Harry Dexter White. It was only in the late 1990s that the US government declassified the so-called Venona decrypts. These were Soviet intelligence cables sent from the United States to Moscow during World War II. They were encrypted, but the code was broken by the United States, and over many decades, they managed to read them. And under the Freedom of Information Act, I got 13,000 pages on Harry Dexter White from the FBI. Among them were 18 Soviet intelligence cables referring to White by his various code names, referring to his activities on their behalf. So I never use the term spy or agent in the book because it gives a misleading impression. Harry Dexter White did not take orders from the Soviet Union. He didn't even take orders from Henry Morgenthau. He marched to his own drum. But there's no doubt that he had deep, deep sympathy with the Soviets and believed passionately that in the post-war period, Soviet economic planning was basically going to take over the world and that the United States would have to accommodate itself to it.
There's an analytical thread that runs through your book, which is a critique of the Bretton Woods system, in that there will always be an irreconcilable tension between national discretion over economic policy and adherence to multilateral rules. And that essentially is what doomed the Bretton Woods system, among other things, and might well be also a reason why coming up with a successor regime might be hard, if not sort of impossible. You lay out in the epilogue of the book some options. They could be a revised gold standard. They could be the equivalent of an SDR in a much more in a much bigger way. Maybe they could be private currencies based on cryptocurrencies or whatever. But do you think all of this is really pie in the sky? Because now that you have two great powers, the likelihood and to the extent that reserve currencies are signal or have something very deep linked to superpower status, this cooperation is very unlikely.
Yeah.
Would you agree, or?
I agree with that. I would point out that when the book came out, I was very surprised to see the reception it was getting in China. In fact, I think I've sold far more copies in Chinese than I have in English. And when I did a little tour in China, I was speaking to packed houses, and I was overwhelmed by this. And the reason is the following. The Chinese love this story because they see themselves as the Americans of the 1940s, and they see us as the British of today, the declining ex-imperial power. So this, to many in China, is a great harbinger for their future. But as I emphasize in the book, Bretton Woods took place in really unique historical circumstances,
Right.
where you had two dominant financial powers. And Britain wasn't finished yet. Its currency still played a significant reserve role, mainly because it wouldn't allow the currency to be converted, but still it was significant. So it was a deal between two countries, and the reason they could do a deal is because one partner was much stronger than the other, and the other had an urgent emergency to deal with, surviving the war. It's possible for me to envision a circumstance in which the United States and China could come up with an equivalent deal. So people have said, well, you know, the Chinese have leverage, for example, they could dump US Treasury bonds. Well, that's an interesting supposition, but let's look back to historically to 56, the Suez Crisis. The Eisenhower administration is angry with the British and threatens to create a sterling crisis by cutting off IMF lending to Britain. Now, the United States could do this in 56 at no cost to itself because US holdings of British securities were trivial, amounting to $1 per US resident, whereas Chinese holdings of dollar-based securities are enormous, amounting to over $1,000 per Chinese resident. So China, obviously, in pursuing such a strategy, would at least in the short term be harming itself as much as it might harm the United States. It's very difficult to see either a basis for a cooperative agreement between the two or a basis under which one could effectively threaten the other, cajole the other into adopting its stance. So I see this standoff persisting.
I'll ask like one last question and then we'll open it up. This is a bit sort of longer question. It's the 75th anniversary of Bretton Woods. It's also within a couple of weeks the 100th anniversary of the Treaty of Versailles.
Yes.
And in a sense, right, what we know is the peace treaty of Versailles, it largely skirted economic questions. Largely it focused on political and legal ones, settling borders, the rights of national minorities, etc. Basically, it failed miserably, right? It did not create any fundamental institutional architecture for governing international economic and political relations. And there's a lot of things why it created these crises build up, leads to World War II, which is precisely why Bretton Woods becomes an answer, what not to do from what we learned at Versailles. And we know, now if you look at the US role then, right, the US refused to join the League of Nations. Right. It was not an active participant in the 1922 Geneva Conference right. for the International Monetary and Financial System. It did not support the League's efforts to negotiate a tariff truce, raised import duties. It did not forgive the war debts right. By its European allies, thereby compounding the German repatriations mess. And it also turned its back hugely in those years on immigration, right? All of these were occurring. And this sort of inward turn, right, as people now argue, was part of this long-standing isolationist. It goes back to Thomas Paine, you know, in his influential tract, Common Sense.
Well, thank God that will never come back.
Okay. So, and 100 years later, tariffs, immigration, multilateralism, all of it. What is you think is similar and what is different?
Look, the United States created the League of Nations and destroyed it because we handled it politically. It was extremely sensitive given the history of the country. It goes back to George Washington's farewell address when he warned us not to get entangled in foreign affairs, in particular in European affairs. So fast forward to 1944, and I would also say 1948 when we passed the Marshall Plan, which was my next book. The U.S. has, in some sense, learned a big lesson. First, about the disasters of U.S. isolationism in the 1920s and 1930s. And they're convinced at this point that World War II might have been prevented had the United States not gone down that horrible path. And we take a very different turn. And President Roosevelt was extremely conscious of this. So, for example, why was Bretton Woods at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire? Well, Roosevelt was keenly aware of President Wilson's failings in not bringing along the Republican Party. And so He was aware that a Republican Senator, Charles Tobey, faced a difficult primary race in New Hampshire. Tobey was an isolationist. He wanted to bring him over to the light side and to the force. And so he thought by giving him this big international conference, not only would he bring Tobey, but Tobey would bring over many of his colleagues. And make a long story short, that's exactly what happened. 1948, the same thing with the Marshall Plan. President Truman absolutely determined to make sure that we don't have World War III by sinking back into isolationism. So, you know, I don't want to belabor the problems that we're living through now, but to some extent, this is not new. This isolationism, as it were, what's called America First. There was an America First committee, right. Yes, which only disbanded after Pearl Harbor, interestingly enough. This is part of our history here in the United States, and we are having a big internal fight right now, a family feud about which direction we're going to go in now.
On that cheerful note, we'll be open to some questions.
We have 1 minute, but we can extend another 5 minutes,
Okay.
finish at
So
10 to 2 and get
maybe
some
we'll
questions.
take just a couple of questions,
I'm fine, sure.
if anyone wants to. Or you're so overwhelmed by our speaker's eloquence.
What do you imagine the next Bretton Woods to be like? Who will be there? Where? What kind of thing would it be, something this pivotal?
Right. I guess going back to the discussion I had with Devesh about this, I don't think we're going to get to that point before the United States and China come to the conclusion that each of them has more to gain from cooperative reform than they have through pursuing their own interest unilaterally. For better or for worse, I believe for worse, we're going in the other direction right now. Both countries have come to the conclusion that they're better off pursuing their interest unilaterally. In the case of the United States, even without its traditional allies, which I consider to be a form of collective insanity, and perhaps individual insanity too, but that's not for public consumption, perhaps. So we are very far away, in my view, from anything that might look like a new Bretton Woods.
And shall we write the history of the World Bank, the last 25 years, guys? Courage.
Certainly not me. Once was enough. We should do it, but no.
It's still totally shocked by the experience of the history of the first 50 years of World Bank. Okay. So no questions? So maybe we can close with... there is a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
This institution evolved in a very particular historical moment. What do you see as the tensions on the institutions now? And for the next 10, 15 years, what direction would you see them moving logically in?
We touched a little bit on this earlier. Both the institutions have evolved quite dramatically since their founding. I mean, the IMF would be almost unrecognizable to Keynes and White. Remember, it was created on a bedrock of gold. That is, that even White believed that the United States could only play this unique role in the international monetary system because it had so much gold. He actually argued in one of his private memos that he wrote to himself that if the United States should ever renege on its gold convertibility pledge, that the international role of the dollar would collapse. So fast forward to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. Of course, the dollar's role didn't collapse, but the IMF now says you're pretty much free to run any sort of national monetary policy you want. You can float your currency, you can peg it, you can have a currency board, but you can't link to gold. That would be quite shocking to Harry Dexter White. Now, the World Bank, of course, has reinvented itself many times, but I don't see this as being some sort of straight arrow forward into future progress, but I think it's actually cyclical. I mean, in the 70s, we had a big debate about large infrastructure problems like dams, the environmental damage they did, the social damage they did. So the World Bank reinvented itself, started focusing on things like environmental policy, on poverty alleviation, on global health. Now, with the rise of a number of new Chinese initiatives, Belt and Road, AIIB, BRICS, it seems that the global focus is shifting back towards infrastructure. And it will be interesting to see if the World Bank tries to, in effect, go back to the future and readopt that role as a means of staying relevant in that area. But there's no doubt in my mind that the two institutions will continue to reinvent themselves as political and economic pressures emerge.
I think there's one very clear difference going forward. The fund still has a reasonable monopoly among multilateral institutions. There's no real competitor.
Right.
Whereas the bank now has, it was the earlier regional MDBs, but now for the first time, it has non-Western dominated institutions led by China, which are going to be very serious competitors to the bank. In a way, the fund still doesn't have that. And I think that is going to affect their different institutional trajectories.
And on this very positive note, we close. Thanking Ben and Barrett. We resume at 2. At 2 in this room, take the selfies, visit the exhibit, go to the dining rooms tomorrow and Wednesday. Bye.
Good afternoon, everyone. I've never had such strong spotlight, so I have no idea who's... okay, right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marianne Fay, Chief Economist for Sustainable Development, and it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Scott Barrett. Scott is currently the Vice Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, where he is also a professor of resource economics. And I should note that when I did my PhD at Columbia, there wasn't a single class on environmental economics, so great improvement. Obviously, things have changed. But Scott is famous for the work that he has done on how to use institutions to solve global environmental problems and things like climate change. He's written quite a lot on this and has published one of the seminal books on the topic. Which makes him an ideal candidate, obviously, for the session on multilateralism, with, I guess, a particular focus this afternoon on global public goods. So Scott will speak about 30 to 40 minutes, so we should have time for questions at the end. We'll go the full hour, so we'll stop at 3:15. Unfortunately, I have to run at 3, but Shanta says that he'll come in and moderate the Q&A, so I apologize for that. Scott, please.
Okay, thanks. But I don't have a pointer, which would have been useful for me. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much. Shanta, thank you for writing to me to invite me. I want to talk about global public goods and how they are or are not provided. So I want to talk about international cooperation, when it succeeds, when it fails, and most importantly, why. Because if we don't understand the reasons for success and failure, we won't know how we could do better. So this is where I want to take the discussion, and I'm going to do it through a combination of history, theory, and lab experiments. This is basically the combination of information we could use to understand these phenomena. So first, some basic principles. I assume everyone here knows the definition of public good. The characteristic of a public good that's particularly critical is that if a global public good is provided, it's available to everyone in the world, and no one can be excluded from enjoying that good. And that inability to exclude is the source of the incentive problem in supplying global public goods, because if people can't be excluded, even if they didn't contribute themselves to the provision of the public good, then they have an incentive to free ride. And free riding, I can tell you, is the problem with international cooperation and addressing these kinds of issues. Now, what does all this mean for the World Bank? Do you have a pointer? Oh, lovely. So what does this mean for the World Bank? One thing I wanted to say is that, terrific, is that global public goods create an opportunity because rich countries are willing to finance the public good because they would also benefit from it. On top of that, they want to make sure that the investment succeeds as opposed to just making a contribution. They actually want to see that there's a return on the investment, so they want to see that the project succeeds. And even if the project isn't aimed at addressing issues of equity, the poorest countries in the world will also benefit from its provision. So there are a lot of reasons why focus on global public goods can be very attractive. Now, there's a subject that I think some people have looked into about the relationship between global public goods and development and the World Bank. Should it be a global public good bank? Should it be a development bank? And I think any careful analysis would see right away that these are complementary activities. In fact, it's kind of hard to do one without doing the other. Let me give you just one example. I could give many, but I'll just give one. I'm working now with the World Health Organization on the possibility of eradicating malaria worldwide, which is an audacious, truly audacious goal. It's probably not feasible, by the way, today. But one thing we know is that the development process itself, by doing things like improving housing stock, building roads, the process of urbanization, all of this is bringing about a reduction in malaria transmission worldwide. And as the transmission falls, the feasibility of eradicating, or certainly, which is feasible today, eliminating within certain countries and eliminating regionally, this becomes easier. So it's almost as if you're developing a kind of technology, an extra tool, to try to supply this public good. On top of that, we know in the other direction that reductions in malaria incidence translate into improvements in income per head. So these two together show that there are complementarities. Now, one of the issues that I'm going to turn to later is climate change. And people might say, well, is it true that there are always complements? Because if I'm a developing country, I need to have energy available for my people to alleviate their poverty. And the cheapest way to do this might be to build a coal-fired power plant. So why shouldn't we be allowed to do that? But of course, if individual countries make that choice, then global emissions of greenhouse gases increase, and that will undermine long-term development. And I think the issue isn't whether the World Bank should be involved in funding coal-fired power plants. The issue should be we should address the global public good problem, which means that there should be an effort to ensure that a country that contemplates building a coal-fired power plant understands that there's an alternative which provides the energy that the country needs for its development, but without releasing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The reason that country wouldn't be pursuing that alternative on its own is that it's an extra cost to using this alternative technology. But then the World Bank's role would be to find the grant financing to make up for the difference, so the country's no worse off if it adopted the alternative technology than if it pursued coal. So I think a retreat behind the idea of financing coal is not sufficient. The World Bank needs to step up and not just step back. Step up in making sure that all new development and also reducing coal-fired power plants that exist already take this threat to long-term development into account. Now, it was interesting, when Nari Woods was speaking earlier today, she was talking about this one country model of development assistance. And I don't know if people noticed, but there was a photograph in the upper right part of the screen. It's actually this photograph here at the bottom. You see with this blind man here being led by this little boy. And I'm sure most of you know the story that Robert McNamara, when he was president of the World Bank in the early 1970s, visited what was called Upper Volta at the time and was really impressed at this tragedy of river blindness, that there are areas in which people had actually vacated because of the disease, and then there are people like this man here who were stricken permanently by the infection. And McNamara led this regional program to eliminate malaria, and it's a program that's been expanded upon over time. And what I find interesting is that this river blindness effort is often mentioned as a great success for the World Bank, but it's such an exception because it was conceived from the very beginning as a regional program. And a lot of issues, like with river blindness and infectious diseases, required a regional approach at best, if not an international approach. Now, another one to mention, so that's a success that's often mentioned, but what about the failures? Well, the thing about the failures is you don't necessarily get to observe them, because these were things that might have been done and weren't. But one I want to draw your attention to involves a cattle disease called Rinderpest. It turned out in the late 1980s, the World Bank was approached to help out with an effort that would also involve the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and the World Organization for Animal Health to eradicate this disease, Rinderpest, which was a true global threat. It was widespread at one time in Europe. It became widespread in Africa. It was in the Americas. It was transported at one point to Australia. So this is a true global threat. And the World Bank's response to this was that Rinderpest eradication was not feasible. And the reason it wasn't feasible is that there basically hadn't been the development that was needed to bring about eradication. And what's so interesting about this particular case is although the World Bank refused to be a partner, the effort went ahead anyway, and it succeeded. The last case of Rinderpest was observed in 2001, and Rinderpest was declared eradicated in 2011. So the World Bank stepped back, other agencies moved forward, and this global public good was supplied. So it begs the question, how many other issues could have been addressed and weren't? The key to understanding international cooperation and providing global public goods is sovereignty, which is also critical for all the one country model as well. So sovereignty is something that we need. This was Thomas Hobbes' main point, that for commerce to flourish, for local public goods, for national public goods to be supplied, you need to have a sovereign who can enforce voluntary agreements entered into by the citizens of a country. Garrett Hardin, in his famous article in The Tragedy of Commons, also appealed to a sovereign to intervene to correct the tragedy of the commons. And of course, at the global level, there's no world government. So when it comes to global problems, we can't rely on the institutions that we take for granted and make use of regularly at the national level to supply national public goods, local public goods. Instead, we have to take the world as it is with about 200 sovereign states and see how we can make them cooperate. Now, the means by which they do this is through international agreements. One ambitious agreement, the Kyoto Protocol under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, was negotiated first in 1997. Actually, it took a few more years to finish the negotiations. And this agreement stumbled and eventually collapsed. This picture is of Peter Kent, Canada's Environment Minister, and he was in Durban at the main climate talks in 2011. And what's interesting about this is that, as you probably remember, George W. Bush refused to take the Kyoto Protocol to the United States Senate for ratification. That's one expression of sovereignty. Canada did ratify the agreement, adopted no policies for meeting it, and was wildly out of compliance. At that point, it had two options. It could violate international law and remain inside the agreement, or, as allowed by international law, it could withdraw from the agreement and then be freed of the obligation to stay within its limits in the Kyoto Protocol. So what happened? Well, Peter Kent returns to Ottawa and within a few hours holds a news conference to say that Canada's withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol. So this is how sovereignty works. And you have to understand how it works in order to understand how we could do better. The biggest expression of sovereignty is the ability of a state to choose voluntarily whether it will participate in an agreement, yes or no. Now, probably the greatest, or certainly one of the greatest achievements of international cooperation in human history is the eradication of a human disease called smallpox. And this good-looking young man should be famous because he was the last person in the world to be infected with what's called endemic smallpox, Ali Maumalan. And had this man not been identified and put under quarantine, and had the people that he had been in touch with recently not been vaccinated, had the people that those people had been in touch with recently not been vaccinated, and so on and so forth, this disease could persist still today. As a consequence of eradication being achieved, and it was declared in 1980, we've saved millions of lives and also avoided the need to vaccinate in the future. Now, why did we succeed in doing this? Okay, so this is where the theory is going to start to come in. These pictures, which I take from figures that Tom Schelling once developed. These are my own versions of them. But on the horizontal scale, you've got the number of other countries. So imagine you've got N countries in the world, and they're all the same. I know that's not realistic, but it's easy to explain this way. And if you introduce complexity, everything gets more complicated, but you don't learn anything extra. So on the horizontal axis, if you look at what are the other countries doing, and you're asking yourself, what should my country do? And your payoff is on the vertical scale here. Well, the best thing you can do if others, the way I've drawn this picture, if others are not eliminating the disease, meaning that there'd be no cases within their territory, then you get a payoff up here, which is higher than what you get if you do eliminate the disease. So what this means is if you have no assurance that other countries will eliminate, you're not going to bother. It's not going to pay off. The cost benefit won't be in your favor. However, you notice what happens over here is if every other country eliminates, the payoff to you of eliminating now jumps up. And the reason is, given that every other country eliminates the disease, when you eliminate the disease, the world eradicates the disease. If the disease is eradicated, there will be no more infections. About a third of people infected with smallpox died, so there'll be no more deaths. And there'll be no need to vaccinate in the future. And that vaccine was not only uncomfortable, but a live vaccine that would kill about 1 out of 1 million people who are vaccinated. So a major savings in terms of costs and in lives. And what you have here, little simple game theory, is that you have a Nash equilibrium on this side, which is if no one else is eliminating, you don't want to eliminate. But another one up here, whereas if you're assured that others will eliminate, you also want to eliminate. And this is where the international system is really good, at choosing between these two and wanting to get to this one. And that's called a coordination game. And one of the messages I want to share is that the world is very good at coordination. This is a lab experiment I did with a colleague in Germany, Astrid Dannenberg. And in this case, we're asking people to play in a laboratory setting coordination game, and you'll see what happens. These are the number of rounds in which they can decide to contribute to the public good, and these are the contributions up here. So initially, some people contribute and some don't, but immediately everyone sees that they're going to be much better off if they all contribute, and everyone contributes, and look at how stable it is. This is when the international system works well. This is the kind of situation that we should be looking for. I mentioned that there's that jump in the payoff that happened just at the very end of the picture. And where does that jump come from? Well, it's this benefit that developing countries get, mainly in the form of avoided deaths. The benefit that rich countries get, mainly in the form of avoided vaccination. So everyone's benefiting here. This is the total. These would be annual figures. And then you have a one-time expense to eradicate. These were numbers put together by the team at the World Health Organization that led this effort, with the poor countries themselves contributing about 2/3 of the total. These were the remaining endemic countries in the world, and the rich countries contributing the balance, which was about $100 million. This is the 1970s dollars. And if you calculate the benefit-cost ratio, where you take into account the total cost, the benefit-cost ratio is 159 to 1. But if you focus on just the international component, the benefit-cost ratio rises to almost 500 to 1. So I don't know how many projects, Shanta, you're evaluating on behalf of the World Bank where you get benefit-cost ratios like that. But I'm pretty convinced, and I've looked at lots of global issues, this one, smallpox eradication, was probably the best single public investment the world ever made. Now, that's a special kind of problem. I'm going to turn to one that we think of more commonly as being the problem of supplying a global public good. So this is a similar picture I showed you before. The metaphor you can think of in this case, when you supply the public, I'm going to give everyone in the room a red card and a black card. And so everyone knows this. And then I'm going to ask you to turn back to me one card. If you keep your red card, you get $5. If you hand in your red card, you get $1. In particular, you get everyone in the room, because this is a public good, gets $1 for every red card handed in by anyone. So what happens here is if no one else hands in a red card, okay, you get 1 if you hand in your red card. You get 5 if you keep your red card, so you're going to want to keep it. And that's actually true. These curves never cross, so that's actually true no matter what everyone else is doing. So you have what's called in game theory terms a dominant strategy to hold on to your red card. But everyone knows that if everyone did that, we'd end up with a payoff of $5 each, whereas if everyone handed in the red card, we're all much better off, and we're going to get $1 times the number of people in this room, which is maybe 200. So that's the gain from cooperation, and that's how to think about this in theoretical terms. This is a linear public goods game, which has been studied very exhaustively. Now, this is what this game looks like if you play it in a lab experiment. Initially, in this case, this is a group of 5 people who are playing this game. Initially, 3 out of 5 contribute, and then it drops to 2, and then 1, and then 0. And then you stop and you ask them, okay, regroup, try again. Okay, 2 now cooperate, and then 1, and then it goes down to 0. Let's see, stop, okay, let's try it again. 1 person cooperates, and then it goes to 0, and then you play one last time. No one cooperates. So what happens at the beginning is there's basically hope, and what's happening down here is there's basically despair. This is a picture I would draw to describe the climate negotiations over the last 25 years. So what helps in this kind of situation? Well, one is communication. Eleanor Ostrom mentioned this. Communication can help. It's essential, by the way, for coordination. It can help with cooperation, but it tends to erode over time. Punishments can help. The problem with punishments is what they can do is they can lift up the contributions, but they only have an effect if they're actually imposed. And when you impose punishments, you're actually lowering payoffs. So it's costly to bring about cooperation. And in these experiments, if you allow retaliation, what tends to happen is you get retaliation, which means you get this fighting, and you get poor contributions and very low payoffs. And actually, this is the whole reason for Thomas Hobbes writing this book on Leviathan, was you want to avoid those situations by having a government step in. By the way, on the subject of retaliation, just note new research by a colleague of mine in economics, David Weinstein, and Stephen Redding from Princeton University, showing that the Trump tariffs are costing the United States, this is from 2018, costing the United States $1.4 billion a month. The cost is borne almost entirely by consumers, and that the countries that are retaliating are bearing similar kind of costs. So retaliation is costly. Now, this is the picture of success in the climate negotiations. This is CO2 in the atmosphere as recorded by Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And this green line is when the climate negotiations started. So I ask you to look at this picture here of CO2 in the atmosphere, and then ask you if you think climate negotiations have succeeded. Well, you know, it's hard to tell because we don't have the counterfactuals. We don't know what would have happened without the climate negotiations, but it's pretty hard to look at this picture and think, hey, that's great, we've done a wonderful job, and, you know, almost as good as smallpox eradication. It's not like that at all. I think it's very hard to see that we've had any effect at all. Now, the Paris Agreement, of course, was this great success, But really, it was a success of diplomacy. It hasn't been a success in terms of really changing things. One thing that was achieved in Paris was an agreement on a collective goal that the world needs to act in concert so as to keep global mean temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial level. Now, why would you get the whole world to agree on a collective goal? The main reason is that no country is responsible for meeting a collective goal. So what did countries do or declare to do on their own? They were going to make their own pledges for what they would do, knowing full well that these were voluntary and that there'd be no consequences in terms of punishments. Now, this is a picture that was actually available in Paris. I presented it, I used it in a presentation I made. This is time over here. These are actual emissions. This band of orange here is a projection of business as usual by the UN Framework Convention on Secretariat. And this yellow bit here and here, these are what the pledges have been from the countries that attended Paris. And you see that the midpoint of these two bands is a little bit below the orange band. So that means that countries are coming in with pledges that are a little bit below business as usual. Now, we don't even know if countries are going to fulfill their pledges. I'm going to come to that, I think, in the next slide. But what I want to point out, what's really important, even with Paris, even with those pledges, even if countries do exactly what they said they're going to do, global emissions will keep rising through 2030. It is impossible to stabilize the climate, let alone to limit temperature change well below 2 degrees C with this picture. It's impossible. So countries have said, we need to act to avoid more than 2 degrees C warming. And then they have proceeded to act to guarantee that that result they said must be avoided will be achieved. To get to 2 degrees, by the way, in 2030, to have a 50% chance of getting to 2 degrees, you'd have to be on this trajectory down here. Now, I want to ask you, what is it that we're going to do in 2030 that we haven't figured out so far? So this is the situation we're in right now. Now, this is another paper I wrote about whether it helps to organize cooperation around the idea that there's a threshold that would be very dangerous that we want to avoid. So when countries say we want to avoid more than 2 degrees C warming, what they're basically saying is once we move into that territory, there's a nonlinear response, and we want to stay clear of that territory. Now, what the theory shows is if you know there's a tipping point and you know where it is, then you have a coordination game, and countries are going to cooperate amongst each other to avoid this catastrophic outcome. And my experiments show that they will do that. But if you widen the uncertainties, so we believe there is a catastrophic threshold, but we don't know where it is, and that's the situation for climate change. We're undertaking an experiment that's never been done before, so we don't know the answer to that question. So what the theory predicts, so this is a level of uncertainty in the horizontal range. So over here you've got no uncertainty, which means you have certainty. And out here, you're getting a lot of uncertainty. This is the aggregate abatement, what the world should do. So if the world cooperated fully, it should go along this curve. And what that means is the reason the world should be abating more as uncertainty widens is that to be sure of avoiding the catastrophic threshold, you have to do more and more and more. Okay? So ironically, as uncertainty widens, the world should be doing more to prevent catastrophic climate change. But actually, what the theory predicts and what the experiment shows is countries actually do less. This is what we're observing in the actual negotiations. So the theory says if the world cooperated fully, we should be going up on this curve, doing more and more and more as uncertainty widens. But the prediction is that if they fail to cooperate, you would get this drop in abatement right at this dividing line. And this is an experiment I did with Astrid. And what you see is to the left of this dividing line, all behavior is just what you'd expect. The green dots are the group proposals for what the group should do. That's like a 2-degree target. The yellow are the individual pledges. These are all known to be voluntary. And these are the actual contributions in the solid blue dots. And what you're able to observe here is a discontinuous drop in contributions once you get past that dividing line. And for a problem like climate change, we're going to be out here somewhere. There's a lot of uncertainty. Yeah, you might say, well, the theory can't be very good because contributions are way up here and the theory predicts they're going to be down here. But this solid gray area here, that marks an area where the cost of contributing to that level is only 50 cents. It's actually really cheap. So this is what I think the world is doing now. we're seeing a lot of cheap action associated with some rhetoric around a deep conviction that I think is sincere, that we need to do more, but we're unable to muster the cooperation we need to get there. Now, one thing that Paris does that's a little different is to allow naming and shaming. So you have to declare what your pledge is, and then other countries can comment on it, and then they get to see how you act over time, and they could comment again about whether you're doing the right thing and so on. Well, the first thing to say about this is naming and shaming has always been part of the game. It wasn't ever ruled out. Now it's being formalized and kind of institutionalized. But will it make a difference? Well, again, I go into the laboratory with Astrid, and what we find, just give you the short summary, what we find is that that context of naming and shaming does change what countries say. In particular, it increases the proposal, what they think the group should do. And this might explain, for example, why the proposal to limit climate change dropped from 2 degrees to well below 2 degrees. So it changes what the players say. It doesn't change what they do. And I think there's no evidence to suggest that the Paris Agreement, which I am in favor of Paris for a lot of reasons, but it's not going to achieve the goal that the countries have set for themselves in Paris. It's not going to achieve it. Now, okay, having depressed you, let's come to another success story. This is protection of the stratospheric ozone layer. This picture here shows you what depletion over Antarctica looked like in 1979, 1987, 2006, 2011. There's already evidence now of repair in the stratospheric ozone hole, and this is due entirely to an agreement called the Montreal Protocol. And because of this agreement, the ozone hole is expected to return to its pre-1980 level sometime in the 2060s. So this is a great success. Now, how did this succeed? Well, one way we could do it is as a voluntary cooperation game where you ask countries to cut back on their consumption of CFCs. So this would be similar to the approach we've taken to address climate change. But then you're going to have this picture here, and we know you're going to have this tendency for countries to not hand in their red cards when they really should be way up here. But what Montreal did that was special is, first off, it didn't just ask countries to cut their consumption, it also asked countries to cut their production of CFCs, consumption and production. You don't have anything like this in the climate negotiations. Also, there were side payments to address the asymmetries that exist between rich and poor countries. The World Bank, of course, is one of the leading agencies involved in the Multilateral Fund. But most critically, it also included a trade ban in the CFCs and products containing CFCs between the countries that are in the agreement and the countries that are outside. And that trade ban completely transforms the game and transforms it from a voluntary cooperation game, which we know doesn't work very well, into a coordination game. So what happens here with the Montreal Protocol is if a country does not, if no other country is participating and your country chooses to participate, now here you're kind of suffering from free riding, but what happens with the trade ban is you suffer even more because now you can't trade in CFCs and products containing CFCs with the rest of the world. So that's a big loss. But at the other end, if every other country's in and you're out, although you could free ride, that would give you this payoff up here, now you get this big loss because now you can't trade with the rest of the world. So this curve ends up coming down here, just like this one comes down at this end, and that means that the curves are going to cross. Where they cross is a tipping point in international behavior, and the trick is to get countries to get past that tipping point, which is actually very easy to achieve. What's significant here is that the Montreal Protocol is able to achieve a first best outcome. So it's actually going to achieve what you'd want to achieve in the voluntary cooperation game. And the reason it's first best is that countries are doing all that they want to do collectively to address ozone depletion. It's that collective action is being enforced by the threat to restrict trade, but trade is actually not restricted. It's not, you don't need to restrict it because the threat itself is sufficient to change behavior. That is like the best of all possible worlds. So why don't we take that logic and apply it to climate change? Well, we did. So there's another agreement called the Kigali Agreement that was negotiated about 10 or 11 months after Paris. And this agreement limits the production and consumption of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. Now, HFCs were included in the Kyoto Protocol, but the Kyoto Protocol failed to address them the way they needed to be addressed. Kigali, maybe not the perfect agreement, but is certainly a step in that direction because it has the features that we have already seen in the Montreal Protocol. But of course, the HFCs are just a small part of the climate problem. There are other parts that we want to address. So this raises the question, why didn't countries pursue this approach in the first place if it's such a great idea? And also, why aren't they pursuing more ideas like this now? Well, there's another agreement I want to talk about, which is about the oceans. This is the Marpol agreement on pollution of the oceans. Most of the oil pollution entering the oceans was released deliberately. So what would happen is the ship would make a tanker would make a delivery of oil and then need to take on seawater for ballast for the return journey. And before picking up the next load of cargo, it would have to flush out the tanks and push the ballast out back into the ocean. But of course, the ballast water had been mixing with the oil that was already in the cargo. So this is how oil would continually be introduced into the seas. And what happened is for 50 years, countries tried negotiating an agreement to limit the releases of oil into the sea, and they just couldn't enforce these. So none of these agreements ever worked. That was 50 years, so we've only wasted 25 so far on climate. But then a new approach was tried, which was to focus on a technology standard. So what you have here is the old standard, and you had, in this case, two tanker areas were dedicated to ballast, but they needed more ballast, so they would fill some of these other cargo holds, which normally would hold oil, with ballast water. With this new agreement, you had to segregate where the ballast water was put from where the oil could be put. And there's no, you couldn't put ballast water into any of the oil tanks. So this eliminated right away the problem of this flushing of oil into the seas. Now, another problem with oil tankers, of course, is the possibility of tanker accidents. Economists object to the idea of a technology standard because they think that you should let parties decide for themselves the best means to achieve something. But we're talking about a second best world here. And it's interesting that because of the problem of accidental releases, this standard here was modified later on so that the segregated ballast tanks are actually put around the perimeter of the hull to give a double hull tanker. So now if there's an accident, there's much lower chance of oil being released into the seas. So what happens here is for the first 50 years, they were trying to pursue the normal voluntary cooperation approach, but then they moved to this standard for tankers. And what happens here again is if very few other countries are in and you adopt the new standard, you get this extra cost because it's not only the case that you have to retrofit the tankers or build a new tanker, but it's also the case that there's precious area on the tanker where you no longer can store oil. So you're going to lose revenue from that. But what happens is, as more ports enforce the new standard, to get access to a port, you have to fulfill the new standard, and so these curves cross. If you stick with the old standard, you lose out, you lose access to ports, but if you go with the new standard, then you gain. So you get, again, this tipping point phenomenon. But what's different here compared to Montreal is that this outcome is second best because of the extra cost of limiting storage of oil on these tankers. And so the payoff you get with this technology approach isn't as good as the ideal if voluntary cooperation succeeded. Now, which game do you play then? Do we play the voluntary cooperation game or do we play the coordination game? Well, in this case, it's not so obvious. With Montreal, there's no sacrifice, so you might as well just go for the coordination game. But here there is a sacrifice, and so to accept the technical standard in this case, it means you have to settle for less, and that's something people are not inclined to do. So here's another experiment in which people are able to choose which game to play. So in this experiment, the A game is the normal cooperation game, and the B game is this coordination game. And what we find is that on the first round, about half the groups choose the cooperation game. That's in the blue. And you see it has a standard pattern of contributions declining over time. But then after that, every group goes for the coordination game. Some go with coordination from, this is the picture I showed you before, by the way. Some go with coordination right away and never deviate. But all the ones that tried cooperation, they saw that it failed and then they switched. And they all coordinated flawlessly. But this is for the first best situation like we saw with Montreal. So if you want a picture, I showed you a picture of climate before. Here's a picture of the Montreal Protocol. Perfect coordination, everything works. It's astonishing. So that's for the first best, where the coordination can achieve a first best. With the second best, what happens is every single group chooses the cooperation game. They're all aiming for the ideal, without exception. But over time, some groups realize, well, we're not doing very well, so let's try, if you look at this one here, let's try the coordination game. Now, they coordinate very well, but then they revert back to the cooperation game. Why? Probably because they saw, hey, we're doing pretty well here, so let's go back to the other one, because the other one could give us a higher payoff. But then cooperation fails there, and then they realize, yeah, we have to go back to the coordination game. And you see the same kind of pattern here. So overall, what you see here is about half the groups try coordination, and when they do, they succeed. The other half never try. And what's interesting is we asked the players if they thought they behaved wisely, and the groups that always chose the cooperation game but did poorly always thought they'd made the best choice. I think if you ask climate negotiators, have you been pursuing the climate negotiations the right way, they would all say yes. But they don't know what the alternative was. They didn't try it, so they don't know. Now, President Macron raised an issue that's starting to attract a lot of interest, and that is, should we link international trade cooperation to cooperation in supplying a global public good? So trade cooperation is easier, and the basic reason for that is that trade is always bilateral. So you can have a multilateral agreement on trade rules, but trade is always bilateral. You and I are trading, you two are trading, and so on and so forth. So everyone's trading with each other, which means you have a kind of a built-in system for reciprocity. And with two players, reciprocity can be very effective at sustaining cooperation. It's when you increase the number of players that it becomes more difficult. So there's a natural tendency to want to say, well, if we cooperate effectively on trade and we can't cooperate on climate, why don't we link these two things and make cooperation on trade conditional on cooperation on climate? So this is the proposal. Now, William Nordhaus, who received the Nobel Prize this year in economics, wrote a provocative paper on this in 2015. Let me just summarize what he found. Here you have different carbon taxes, so $12.50 per ton CO2 up to $25, $50, and $100. And on this scale here, you have the number of regions. And these different bars here reflect different tariffs that would be set. So he's got a climate club, he calls it, where if you're in the club, you adopt the carbon tax, and you impose a tariff of anywhere from this is 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10% against non-members of the club. And what he's trying to ask is, would the imposition of this tariff cause countries to want to join the club? And what you see is if the carbon tax is very low, you get full membership of the club, which means, a bit like the Montreal Protocol, that you get full provision of the public good, but only up to $12.50. But you also have liberal trade. So at least you're not sacrificing on the trade side. As the carbon price increases, you have to use a higher and higher tariff in order to sustain that full cooperation. And when you get to $50, and today's social cost of carbon has to be at least that high, when you get to $50, you see the cooperation starts to collapse. And now only some countries are in the club and some are outside. And when you get to 100, and we'll definitely be there in the near future if we're not already there, then you see it works even less well. So even if you buy the Nordhaus story, it's still not a complete solution to the climate problem. This is not like smallpox eradication or the ozone depletion. He makes a really critical assumption, though, and that is that countries will refrain from retaliating. And everything we know about the trade system, and you're seeing it in the newspapers all the time now, is that there's a very high likelihood that there will be retaliation. Now, what I did is I wrote a very simple theory to try to explain what's going on, because it's hard to tell from his simulations what's going on. And what the theory shows is, depending on the parameter values, you can have one of four outcomes. You can have a Princess dilemma. That's what you get in these areas here. So what's happening here with the Princess dilemma is there's no point in linking with trade. It doesn't help at all. You can also have a chicken game. A chicken game means some countries are in the club and some are outside. But that means you're only getting partial cooperation on climate, and you're getting trade restrictions. But that's these cases here, like these here, and all of these over here. Another possibility is you get a coordination game, and you can also have a cooperation game meaning that every country has a dominant strategy to join the club. Now, when you have full participation here and here, you can't tell which of those games exist. Is it a coordination game or a cooperation game? You can't tell. If you abandon the assumption about retaliation, then it turns out there can only be two possibilities, either Prisoner's Dilemma or a coordination game. All these simulations you see here, what the theory shows is that these will all be Prisoner's Dilemmas. So as good as this picture looks, which is, again, not very good for climate, it's worse, as long as you have to worry about the prospect of retaliation. And what I can also show is in the best possible case you have coordination, and coordination is going to be difficult. That's true theoretically. Now, Bill Nordhaus solves his model using a computer algorithm, but I'm more interested in how people would actually choose. So Astrid and I go back into the laboratory. So what we're doing here is we're looking at the best case. So what I mean is we have parameter values that mean that you have a coordination game. So I'm stacking everything in favor of this working, and we don't know if the conditions apply to sustain those assumptions. So what we find here, we start off where everyone has to play the unlinked game, which is the game we've been playing for the last 25 years. And then if they want, they can choose to try the alternative of linking with trade. And what you find is if you have a unilateral system where any country can make that choice on its own, every group is going to try at some point to make the linkage. But what you see is in some cases coordination succeeds, like here, but in other cases it fails. And you notice when it fails, payoffs are a lot lower when you try to link with trade than if you don't. And that's because you're not only failing to address climate change, you're also taking away the benefits of liberal trade regime. So that's with a unilateral regime. We also looked at a multilateral regime. So with a multilateral regime, which is more like the Montreal model, you need to have a critical mass of countries agree to link, and then that agreement enters into force. So now you don't have this issue of just one country or two countries deciding to do it. You have to have a critical mass. So what happens in this case with multilateral is you'll see coordination succeeds virtually every time. I think here it didn't, but it did in the end. But in most cases, it succeeds quite well. But there are a lot of cases where it's never even tried. Because now it's not just one country that gets to decide if we try this. You have to get this critical mass of countries, and they don't do it. So what happens here is the worst cases are avoided. You don't get these terrible trade wars. But at the same time, some opportunities for linkage are missed. So the basic result of this, I think, is that we don't know yet whether the conditions apply for making this kind of linkage, but what we do know is that if linkage is to be made, it should be made multilaterally and not unilaterally. Okay. So what do we know, just to sum up? Multilateralism, when it's effective, promises huge rewards for the whole world. Voluntary cooperation, which is probably the first impulse countries have for how to address, how to bring about, how to supply public goods, is difficult. And that may be putting things charitably. Coordination, countries are very, very good at coordination. So my final conclusion is, if you want to achieve the provision of global public goods through multilateralism, let's do it by asking countries to do what they're good at, which is coordination, and not what they're bad at, which is voluntary cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. We'll take some questions now, and Shanta, maybe you want to. Okay. So maybe just to get us started while people are warming up, the one question that, or rather the request, would be for you to explain a little bit why technical standards are in fact an optimal choice. Because one of the things we hear, particularly amongst economists, is carbon prices. They will solve the world's problems, right? And it's very difficult to get beyond the carbon price argument. And of course, we know we need carbon prices for efficiency. But you're doing a call for pragmatism here. So maybe expanding a little bit upon the alternative tools or the complementary tools to carbon prices.
Yeah. So if we had an definitely support carbon tax. I think it's by far the best way to go. You would need some other things as well, like you have to worry about R&D and other things. But the case for the carbon tax is extremely strong. We don't have a world government. By the way, there's a lot of economics that seems to presume a kind of a central planning atmosphere. It's quite strange. We don't have that. We have, as I mentioned, almost 200 governments. So the reason that the technology standards presents itself as something to consider is precisely because we're in what I'll call a second best world, which is we have to get countries to act even when they can't make commitments, even when there is no world government that can enforce outcomes. And that's the only reason. So there's no ideology, I hope, in what I'm presenting. It's all about practical. You want to know what works. But as I said, I've combined the theory and experiments with history. We know that Marpol that the effort to clean up the oceans failed for 50 years. We know that. And we know that everything turned around when the technology standard was adopted. And then economists bemoan technology standards because you get this phenomenon of lock-in. But we didn't get lock-in. They negotiated a new set of standards. Montreal Protocol, by the way, has been renegotiated over and over and over and over again. Every good agreement should be worked with that way. It's been extremely successful. But these are unusual approaches, and they're successful. The main insight I have from working on cooperation issues for quite a long time is this insight I'm sharing about the power of coordination. So that's the only reason that I would advocate for technology standard.
Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. This is Gianni Ruta, here from the World Bank. How about biodiversity? We're preparing for a big conference of the parties in 2020 in China. Is there any hope for the convention to have more teeth? Much of biodiversity loss, well, a lot of it gets traded, right? When soy leaves Brazil and goes to Asia, or beef gets exported to Europe, etc. So is there a space there for getting trade into the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity as well? Thank you.
Well, I'll probably give a incomplete, imperfect answer, so I want to lower your expectations. I know biodiversity, it's a very complicated topic, and there are many dimensions to it, some of which, of course, do involve trade, as we all know. You have invasive species. I mean, that is, an outcome of trade, and that's always happened in the world, and humans have propelled that tendency. The thing I would say about biodiversity, I was actually involved in the first meetings to map out how would you negotiate a treaty on biodiversity conservation. And I saw things heading in a bad direction from the very beginning. This is a very complicated topic. The proposal I made was to take insight from an agreement called the World Heritage Convention. So this is an agreement that applies to sites like the Great Pyramids in Egypt, and I think Yellowstone National Park, and the Virunga Mountains in Rwanda, a number of places like that. And what this agreement says is, let's identify places that belong to the World Heritage. There's an obligation by the state, which actually has to make this proposal, to protect it, but then there's a collective obligation by other states, because this is the World Heritage, that they're going to contribute to the costs of supporting, maintaining, protecting these sites. And I thought this should be extended for biodiversity, where this was again the late 1980s, the focus in those days was on the idea of hotspots, where you had certain biomes that you saw as being quite critical with a high level of endemism. And I thought the most practical way to approach the problem would be to identify those areas, get agreement that these are part of the World Heritage, and that there should be then collective finance to make it possible to protect those areas. Unfortunately, the negotiations went off in a completely different direction. I was surprised and quite pleased. I read a recent book by E.O. Wilson on biodiversity. And there's nowhere in that book does he mention the Convention on Biological Diversity. Nowhere in that book. But he did mention, this is quite surprising to me, the World Heritage Convention. So I think, unfortunately, how we approach a problem is quite critical. In the early days, it's not so clear. Climate change, why did we approach it the way we did? I have spoken to people who were involved in the first meeting. It was in Toronto in 1988. And they told me how it happened, and people familiar with my work anyway have said that they think that we get off on the wrong foot. So how do you look at something that's unprecedented, that we've never done before? I think this is the reason why I do this research, because unless we learn these things, and you have to do it probably by looking at history, probably you have to pull back the curtains and see, well, what's actually behind there? So the idea, the value of the theory and the experiments, of course, they're not conclusive, but they suggest that there are different ways we could do things, and only by looking at that evidence can we have any sense of whether we might have done better if we had taken a different approach.
I'm Tito Cordella from DEC. Just a quick question. As much as I really like your analysis, and the model is pretty clean, the only doubts that I have may be influenced by what's happening at the southern border, is they used to use another public good as a threat and a punishment if somebody doesn't abide to a particular treaty. So the idea of saying there is a punishment in terms of trade if you don't abide to new regulation on climate change, it can be good. On the one hand, it pushes people to abide to the regulation, but the other, you can also end up in a world in which there would be no trade and no environmental regulation. And so the idea, more generally, at some point, you can say, then I can use trade as a punishment if you don't abide, use of Meister's southern border example, to my migration policy, so on and so forth. So what is the kind of public good that is safe to use as a threat and without having the risk of throwing the baby with the bathwater?
Oh, yeah, I completely agree with that. So I gave you two different ways to think about this. I think it's true that coordination works. So then the question, well, how do you approach it? And I gave you two different ways of doing it. One is you take the climate problem into pieces, and you see if you can bring about coordination in individual pieces. This is something I've been advocating for probably 15 years. This is what the Kigali Amendment does, right? It takes out, let's take HFCs. So one way to do it is let's just look at individual components and then ask, where do we get leverage on those individual components that we can bring about reductions collectively through coordination? The other way to do it is a more brutal way, which is the Bill Nordhaus way. And by the way, I don't know how many people know him, but he's a very careful person. So he's not a radical. So I find it really fascinating that he's pursued this approach, but it's a very kind of a blunt approach. I'm fascinated by it, but I'm concerned about it. I really am, because I think there is the risk. Well, first off, we don't know empirically if the conditions that need to apply for coordination to succeed there exist. And in particular, you have to take into account both the gains to cooperation on trade to attract people towards the linked agreement, and also you need to know the benefits of free riding, which keep people out of the linked agreement. Those are the things the theory identifies are the most important. I don't think we have enough of a handle on those values to know whether this would even be potentially desirable. But what I do know is that we're much safer off if we pursue this multilateral approach. And what I'm very much opposed to is just raw unilateralism. So I think these are the two models. I hope you understood that neither of them is perfect. The sectoral approach, where you take things apart, which is the one I've been pushing for, I know very well that it's got enormous limitations. So we can achieve more than we're doing now, but we can't do everything we need to do because we have to reduce net emissions to zero, and we should do it quickly. So I don't see it getting to where we need to go, and I think the Nordhaus analysis, you saw the numbers there. A carbon tax, once it gets up to $50 per ton, it won't work anymore. Well, social cost of carbon must be at least that now. So I don't see either of these approaches as being a solution, which is why I think we need to be thinking about much more radical measures. So these are all oriented towards reducing emissions, which means not putting something in the atmosphere that isn't already there. There are two other approaches you can take that are really quite extreme. One is you remove carbon from the atmosphere, and tree planting is not sufficient for that. So you'd have to use industrial processes to take CO2 out of the air, a technology called air capture. we have to consider this technology, and I think actually the collective provision of this technology, I think there's pretty good reason for thinking it would be a coordination problem. The cost would be high, but you're talking about funding a global project. The other approach, which is more controversial, is using geoengineering to throw particles into the stratosphere to cool the planet. And I know people don't like that, and certainly when anyone first hears of the idea, they think it's crazy, and I had the same reaction. But I used to worry that we might use it when we shouldn't, and I think now I'm beginning to worry about the alternative, which is that we don't use it when we should. I think you can't be alarmed about the effects of climate change and then say, we're going to take off the table the one technology we think could actually limit temperature change in the near term.
Thank you for a very interesting keynote speak. I'm Anni Norring. I'm from the Bank of Finland. And Finland being a tiny country with about two handfuls of people, we are very keen on multilateral cooperation because we see that that's the only way that we can actually affect things. Finland is co-chairing the Climate Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. And that coalition of countries met at Helsinki earlier this year, and the finance ministers that are part of this coalition signed what are called the Helsinki Principles. What's your take on these principles? Will they have any effect at all on anything? Is it a group of countries that are first comers and will have an effect, or is it just a handful of countries playing the savior game? Thank you.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I'm deeply embarrassed because I don't know about these principles. So either that's an answer to your question or that's a reason not to listen to me. I just simply don't know them. My apologies. You know, normally I mention geoengineering because it's guaranteed to provoke a reaction, but I guess not in this case.
Scott, if there are no other questions, let me just ask you something that has been puzzling me a little bit, given your examples, because you had many more successful examples on the health side than on the environment side, except for the Montreal Protocol. Is there something intrinsic about health that makes it more feasible to achieve either a coordinated solution or even a cooperative solution, as opposed to some of these environmental problems that we're dealing with?
Yes, I mean, what I was trying to show was that, by the way, I didn't look at just any health problems, right? I looked at eradication. And eradication is an extreme goal, and it does create this weakest link situation. And that gives a very powerful incentive for countries to act. And we also know very clear evidence of whether those actions succeed or not. With the environment, with the way I looked at it as a linear public goods game, those are the ones that are always the most difficult. They create the biggest challenges. So I think it helps to break this big topic of global cooperation into pieces. So another one I didn't mention is this idea of what I call a single best effort, which is you would apply this to the two geoengineering options I mentioned, for example, or the CGIAR's research into new agricultural technologies, so researches like that, where you only need one success. So if you wanted to remove CO2 from the atmosphere, you would just build machines to a sufficient scale to achieve that. If you wanted to put particles in the atmosphere, you would have an intervention to do that. Funding for these single best efforts, that's a coordination game, and we're very good at that. So examples would be the financing of research on nuclear fusion research, or on the particle collider, the famous particle collider. So it's really it's not so much whether it's health or its environment, it's much more the kind of structural dimensions of the game itself. That seems to be what's common about these problems. But in the health area, of course, another advantage is when the cooperation makes a big difference for people's lives, well, then that's when countries are willing to put a lot of resources to it. One more thing I just mentioned on health. There's another, I'm surprised people didn't ask me about polio, because there's an effort to eradicate polio. It's been underway since 1988. And it was supposed to have succeeded in 2000 and came very close in 2000. And it's been very close ever since. And you might think, well, okay, that failure to get polio over the line, as it were, that must be discouraging for the international community. But I could show you a picture that, two pictures. One shows the number of, if time is on this axis, the number of cases dropping like this and then staying almost at zero thereafter. And on the other picture over here, over time, you see financing to achieve eradication, and it goes up like this. So as cases drop, financing goes up. And it stays up. It's quite remarkable. So the reason we may not succeed with polio, and we don't know yet, we won't know until it happens, is not because of insufficient finance. It's going to be because there are technical and social and political problems, primarily in the border region of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and not a free riding problem.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end here, so please join me in thanking Scott Barrett for a very interesting presentation.